I'm Howard Friedman. I'm the director of the Jewish Community Library in San Francisco, and I'm very glad to welcome all of you. I also want to thank our co-presenters, Cause California, and the Workers Circle, Arbiter Ring of Northern California, two great organizations. As always, I want to thank the Friends of the Jewish Community Library who make everything we do at the library possible, particularly now that the library is independent. I hope you will consider becoming a friend by giving at any level at friendsofthejcl.org. Please note that automated closed captioning can be turned on or off by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. You can assume, unfortunately, that the transcript will convert any Yiddish word to gibberish. We'll all be muted except our presenter, but people will have the opportunity to ask questions after the presentation. So you can please put your questions in the chat and then I'll relay them. It's great having Ayelet Brinn with us. She's the Philip D. Feltman Assistant Professor of Modern Jewish History in the Departments of Judaic Studies and History at the University of Hartford. A Revolution in Type, Gender, and the Making of the American Yiddish Press is her first book, and I'm very pleased to say that 2 weeks ago, it was announced as one of the 2 finalists for the National Jewish Book Award in the category of Women's Studies. So Ayelet, thank you very much for being with us, and we look forward to learning from you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Can everyone hear me? Thumbs up. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen and then we can get started. Share. All right, second thumbs up that you can see my PowerPoint, yes? Great. So thank you so much again for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of my research with you today. I'll be speaking for about 40 minutes or so, and then opening up to questions and comments. So to start off my talk, I want to give you a bit of a sense of how I came to this topic and the questions that animate it. I came to history through my passion for archives, so part of my process of deciding on a research paper topic during my first year of graduate school was exploring the finding aids of various collections at local libraries and archives, which I hoped would give me some sense of how the resources available to me might shape my development as a scholar and the questions I'd be asking about Jewish history and American history and culture going forward. So when I looked through the finding aids at the University of Pennsylvania's library, I noticed that they had the archives of B.Z. Goldberg, who was a prominent New York-based Yiddish journalist and the son-in-law of Sholem Aleichem, a central figure in the development of modern Yiddish literature. The collection description included a brief biography of Goldberg that especially piqued my interest. So about halfway through, it described how Goldberg got his start in Yiddish journalism. Quote, wishing to write for the Yiddish newspaper The Day, but being told by the editor that he didn't have the popular stuff the newspaper needed, BZG wrote under his secretary's name a popular feature under the title A Diary of a Young Woman. Edlin, the editor, didn't believe it was the secretary, but published the articles anyway. They were an instantaneous success and ran for a number of months. When the identity of the real author was revealed, Goldberg became a correspondent of The Day and a permanent member of the staff. So immediately I was struck by this narrative, how it suggested that only by masquerading as a woman could Goldberg gain a foothold in the Yiddish press. I found the repetition of the word popular particularly interesting, suggesting to me that it was not only the content that Goldberg submitted that the editor viewed as popular, but also that there was some sense that writing by women, or in this case, a man who was pretending to be a woman, was seen as more popular in and of itself in Yiddish journalism at this time, which would have been in the early 1920s. So as I'll return to later on in my talk, when I talk about Goldberg in more detail, there are actually several factual inaccuracies or pieces of misleading information in this paragraph. This biographical note was adapted from an essay by Goldberg himself, and like many figures associated with the Yiddish press, he wasn't always a reliable narrator about the details of his life. But this narrative immediately sparked questions for me. So what led Goldberg to conflate the editor's desire for popular writing with writing by, for, or about women? And was this part of a broader pattern or just a strange, interesting case study? So I started digging through firsthand accounts of the Yiddish press in this period, and it turns out that rumors were rampant that many young men like Goldberg were deciding to submit manuscripts of various genres to American Yiddish newspapers under female names. Unlike other contexts I was familiar with before, when women had to pose as men to get published, rumors were abounding in the context of the Yiddish press in the United States that it was instead advantageous for men to pose as women. So here's one example I found. This is by the journalist Yosef Chaikin, who described it as a common phenomenon, not just in articles, but also in poetry submitted to one prominent newspaper. According to him, countless anecdotes have circulated among writers about their experiences with Janowski, who was a newspaper editor. Dozens of poets published poems under women's names, which under their own names had been rejected. So in Chaikin's assessment, this reflected the editor's sort of general desire to feature women, but also some sense of different standards used for work by men and work by women. Chaikin's statements about countless men employing this strategy is an exaggeration, but there are actually several traceable cases of men writing under female pseudonyms in the Yiddish press. In addition, this phenomenon was not actually limited to the 1910s and 1920s, but instead occurred throughout the history of the press. But what men decided to write under female pseudonyms and how they described their decisions to do so changed significantly over time in ways that trace the development of the Yiddish press and its changing relationship to American culture and transnational Jewish culture. So this description sparked my interest in exploring a broader research topic, investigating the relationship of the Yiddish press and gender in all of its complexities, encompassing women writers, attempts by authors to reach female readers, and the ways that questions of gender lay at the very heart of American Yiddish journalism. So at the turn of the 20th century, Yiddish newspapers were incredibly influential political and cultural institutions. They set the tone for American Jewish life and served invaluable roles for their hundreds of thousands of readers. There have been Yiddish speakers in the US for centuries, but the number of Yiddish speakers rose dramatically during a wave of mass immigration from Eastern Europe that was strongest between about the 1880s and 1920s. And in these years, the number and variety of American publications in Yiddish increased exponentially. So by the 1920s, if you were a Yiddish-speaking farmer, housewife, theater goer, humor lover, you could find a periodical that catered specifically to your interests. But there were also newspapers, especially daily newspapers, that wanted to attract a broader audience. Each of them had a specific ideological agenda: Orthodox Judaism, socialism, communism. But the most successful ones tried to court a mass audience, including those outside of their ideological window. And the rationale was that if the paper could reach a broader public, they could trounce rivals in the battles for circulation, advertising, and ideological influence. So it's important to keep in mind that this transformation of Yiddish newspapers into successful and basically essential institutions was in no way inevitable. There was no real precedent for Yiddish newspapers on this scale in Eastern Europe. There were really a handful of European Yiddish weeklies and monthlies before the 1880s, but most of them attracted relatively small and elite reading audiences. And because of censorship laws restricting Yiddish publishing in the Russian Empire, the first Yiddish daily newspaper in Europe did not appear until about 20 years after the founding of the first Yiddish daily in the United States. So the mass consumption Yiddish press blossomed as an American phenomenon before it took hold in Europe. And because of this, many Ashkenazi Jewish immigrants, especially those who came over before about 1900, had never read a newspaper before coming to the United States. But quickly on their arrival, many began seeing newspapers as indispensable parts of their daily lives. Newspapers became a sort of fusion of friends, advisors, tour guides, entertainers, and social welfare agencies. And by the 1920s, not only was there a broad market of options to choose from, but the Yiddish press had become by far the most successful foreign language newspaper market in the United States. The circulation of the most popular daily, the Forward, surpassed 200,000 issues at its peak and even at times exceeded that of the New York Times. So it was profoundly successful. So in A Revolution in Type, my book, I argue that questions of women and gender are crucial to understanding how and why the Yiddish press became such a powerful and multivalent force in American Jewish life. So I make this case through a close reading of the most influential newspapers that span the ideological range of the Yiddish press, from the socialist Forward to the Orthodox conservative Jewish Morning Journal. these newspapers espoused very different ideological agendas, even though all of them were actually produced within several blocks of each other in an area of New York's Lower East Side called Yiddish Newspaper Row. But reading these newspapers in tandem allowed me to see just how much they influenced each other and how often writers actually went back and forth between these publications. Sometimes these writers changed their messaging in order to fit the ideological line of their writing venue. But in other cases, their arguments were remarkably consistent across publications, even when this actually undermined or contradicted the overall ideological project of these publishing venues. It also allowed me to see that women's content was present from almost the very start of the Yiddish press, but became more complex and more salient over time. Over time, editors introduced a variety of content that they asserted was meant to appeal to female readers. This included advice columns, serialized fiction, advertising, women's columns, and eventually women's pages. In reality, obviously, these features were popular with men as well as with women, and women's reading habits were never actually confined to the parts of the paper that were marked for women, but editors repeatedly highlighted their intention to attract female readers using this content. And at each stage of the press's development, debates about women and gender also became prisms through which editors or publishers explored the roles they wanted their papers to play in readers' lives. In fact, newspaper producers with very different ideological agendas all invoked the needs and interests of female readers to represent their desire to build a mass audience. So Abraham Kahan, who was the longtime editor of The Forward, boasted that when he took control of the paper, he turned it into a publication that, quote, the masses of the Jewish people and even women could read. Yechezkel Saracen, who was part of the Orthodox Jewish Daily News, described his desire to turn his newspaper into a product that women would pick up at the market along with other household goods. And conversely, once he had established himself as a Yiddish journalist, B.Z. Goldberg asserted that any time a newspaper published something that addressed women, they were really trying to reach the masses, the folk, the people. So these discussions reflected long-standing traditions in Yiddish culture that equated the reading needs of female audiences and mass audiences. So for Jews in early modern Eastern Europe, Yiddish was the language of everyday life, as opposed to the more scholarly or religious Hebrew. Women generally had pretty limited access to religious knowledge and were not taught to read Hebrew. So anything written in Yiddish was seen as having an implied female or mass uneducated audience. Because Hebrew literacy and religious knowledge were crucial to masculine identity, those who read in Yiddish were often referred to by authors as women and men who are like women. And in this context, some men decided to write their Yiddish writing under female pen names to separate it out from their more masculine Hebrew output, or out of a sense of shame at writing in such a purportedly lowbrow language. So therefore, the Yiddish press's relationship to gender and mass culture built on these previous traditions in Jewish culture. But at the same time, these discussions within the Yiddish press equally drew on newer trends that were taking shape in American journalism, that were beginning to equate female readers with turning newspapers into mass consumption publications. In this period, American newspapers transformed from being funded mainly by political parties to being funded by advertising and subscriptions, meaning that newspapers had to attract a broader pool of readers and advertisers than ever before. Many advertisers assumed that women were the ones buying their products, so this was the period where mainstream newspapers in the United States began to include women's columns, women's pages, advice columns, all of these things for the first time, all to demonstrate to advertisers that women read their periodicals. So in determining how to cultivate a mass audience for their own publications, the producers of American Yiddish newspapers looked to these innovations as a model. So they harnessed the blueprint of the American popular press at precisely the time when attracting a female audience lay at the heart of what it meant to be a mass consumption newspaper in the United States. Publishers incorporated the types of content the English language press introduced, and for Yiddish papers, appealing to women readers became deeply intertwined with trying to adapt to broader trends in American culture. So throughout the history of the Yiddish press, gender became the prism through which the Yiddish press continually reshaped the boundaries between traditional and modern, political and commercial, and between American and international Jewish trends. So this made women's columns, women's pages, and other spaces within Yiddish newspapers that were similarly gendered particularly dynamic, but it also made them sort of full of contradictions because the various political, cultural, and commercial priorities of Yiddish newspapers were very rarely neatly aligned. So only through this gendered history can we really understand the full power and the full complexity of the history of the American Yiddish press. So in my book, I explore sort of various facets of the Yiddish press's changing relationship to gender. This includes discussions of the changing content in these papers, exploration of the work that women perform behind the scenes as translators, secretaries, and writers of anonymous content. And I'm happy to expand on any of these aspects during the Q&A if people are interested in hearing more. But for the rest of my talk, I want to turn back to the phenomenon of men writing under female pseudonyms. And I'll offer 3 short case studies. The first 2 are men who chose to write under female pseudonyms at 2 very different stages in the history of the press. And the third is a female writer whose writing was so good that rumors constantly followed her that her female byline must be a cover for a male author. So together, the lives and careers of these journalists give a sense of the crucial but very inconsistent and complex role that questions of women and gender played in the development of the Yiddish press. So my first case study is a man named Getzel Zelikovic. He wrote the first women's column in any Yiddish newspaper, and he used the pen name The Lithuanian Wise Woman. Zelikovic had a really fascinating life and had one of the more, I guess, varied backgrounds in Yiddish journalism. He was born in 1863 in what is now Lithuania. After receiving a traditional religious education, he moved to Paris to study Egyptology, and he served as a translator on British expeditions to Egypt. He then moved to America and was briefly a professor at the University of Pennsylvania before resigning or being forced out under somewhat mysterious circumstances. And then he moved to New York and shifted to a career in journalism. So in 1890, Zelikovic joined the staff of the Orthodox, politically conservative Tageblatt, which is also called the Jewish Daily News. The paper had been founded about 5 years earlier and was the first Yiddish daily to survive for more than a few issues anywhere in the world. Zelikovic joined its staff at a time when its publisher was trying to transform it into a more successful commercial venture by expanding its advertisers, buying up rival publications, and transforming the paper's content to more closely resemble the sensational style of the most successful American newspapers. And both Zelikovic and his publisher saw his women's columns as an integral component of this process. So he began writing as the Lithuanian Wise Woman in 1891, and he continued to use this persona on and off for about 20 years. In its earliest days, the column carried the dual title of Ezras Nashim and Ladies' Corner, which is Ladies' Corner translated and transliterated into Yiddish. This title was a sort of play on words. Ladies' Corner was a very common title at this time for women's columns in the English language press, but Ezras Nashim was also the phrase used to refer to the women's section of an Orthodox synagogue. So read in different ways, the title signaled the paper's commitments to both tradition and adaptation. So in these columns, Zelikovic offered readers a fusion between ideologically driven and entertainment-driven content. And in some ways, these goals diverged because the column's tongue-in-cheek style sometimes undermined their sincerity. But in other ways, by repackaging his guidance in entertaining wrappings, Zelikovic ensured that readers would absorb his arguments more fully. So the most overt function of these columns was to convey the paper's views on women's roles in society. And Zelikovic often highlighted women's supposedly innate attraction to housework and motherhood. He also expressed somewhat qualified support for women's rights, as basically all Yiddish newspapers did across the ideological spectrum. And right for a religious publication, his columns particularly highlighted the role of mothers in ensuring that the next generation could grow up religiously observant. So he was purportedly speaking from the position of a woman and mother of children, and he used the Lithuanian Wise Woman to model his vision of proper Jewish womanhood. So for example, he once explained to readers that the column would be appearing a day earlier than usual because, quote, like all women, the Lithuanian Wise Woman would be too busy preparing her house for the upcoming holiday of Passover to write her column on its usual day. So throughout his time writing as the Lithuanian wise woman, Zelikovic set up a somewhat complicated relationship between his women's columns and the rest of the newspaper. In some ways, he suggested these columns were a sort of separate sphere, a female oasis within a male-centric publication. But at other times, Zelikovic strongly evoked an avid male readership for these women's columns, saying it was a popular column with male and female readers alike. And over time, he emphasized the connections between his women's columns and the rest of the paper by fostering a sort of active dialogue between the Lithuanian wise woman and various other personas on the pages of this newspaper. So one example of this was in 1908, when he wrote an article under his own name where he responded to the Lithuanian wise woman's most recent column, which was praising British suffragettes. So in it, he criticized the Lithuanian wise woman for praising non-Jewish women instead of acknowledging historical Jewish champions for women's rights. So instead, Zelikovic argued that the biblical prophet Deborah should be seen as the first suffragist, and that there was a rich history of Jewish feminists long before the contemporary suffrage movement. So this column was a reflection of a pretty common rhetorical strategy in the Jewish daily news, arguing that political or cultural innovations in the US or abroad had strong historical Jewish precedents. So many articles, for example, argued that Judaism was innately the most feminist religion, and therefore that supporting women's rights was in no way inconsistent with Orthodox Jewish practice. So to be sure, in making this argument, the paper staff carefully selected certain aspects of Jewish tradition while omitting or reshaping others. But for the paper staff, these arguments served to make Judaism and Jewish history compatible with contemporary social trends. In so doing, they hope to offer models for readers about how to acclimate to surrounding trends while still remaining religiously observant. Sorry, there's like a ambulance going on outside, so I hope you can't hear too much of that. So by writing these articles under two names, Zelikovic found ways to express support for women's rights and religious continuity, while also providing his audience with entertaining reading material. He also created a sense of a lively newspaper staff in dialogue with one another, and also much larger than it actually was. And he also reinforced the notion that reading newspapers like the Jewish Daily News was an interactive process where articles spoke to one another and also to the concerns of readers' daily lives. So Zelikovic, his column was one of the most long-running women's columns to appear in any Yiddish paper. But in many ways, the introduction of the column initially in the 1890s reflected a broader trend happening in the Yiddish press at that time. In fact, he wasn't the only editor of a Yiddish paper to try his hand at writing women's columns in this period. So in 1898, Michal Zemetkin, who was an early editor of the socialist daily The Forward, also introduced a women's column under the pen name Sophia Housewife, or Sophia Heusfreu. In it, he explored women's issues from overtly radical perspectives. So though Zemetkin and Zelikovic's women's columns had very different politics, together they demonstrate how Yiddish newspapers across the board began directly appealing to female readers in this period. They also reflect the fact that the majority of women's columns in the early history of the Yiddish press were written by men. This only began to change after about 1914, when all of the major Yiddish dailies began publishing women's pages for the first time. Again, in introducing women's pages, the American Yiddish press outpaced the European Yiddish press, where dailies only introduced women's pages starting about 10 to 20 years after American ones. Much of the content on these women's pages was still written by men, but these pages opened up some room for some women to gain footholds in Yiddish journalism. Even though the number of women writers remained quite small, editors began emphasizing their supposed support of female writers. Usually, this was more of a marketing strategy than an accurate assertion. For some editors, including articles by women, became a way to signal their paper's more progressive approach to journalism. For others, it was an attempt to boost circulation, as they viewed writing for or by women as more popular or juicy. In either case, it became a way for editors to signal that the Yiddish press had reached a new, more modern stage in its development. So all of this helps provide some context for my second case study, B.Z. Goldberg. In earlier periods of the history of the Yiddish press, men writing under female pseudonyms were generally the editors of these publications. In contrast, beginning in about the 1910s, maybe even slightly before, rumors began to circulate that young men like B.Z. Goldberg were submitting work under female names without editors' knowledge. So in this case, Goldberg was studying towards a graduate degree in psychology at Columbia, when he decided to transition to writing for Yiddish newspapers. And according to Goldberg, submitting articles under a female name greatly eased this transition. So I'll return now to this biographical statement about Goldberg that I showed you at the beginning of this talk. This isn't the only source where Goldberg recounted his origin story. Each time he changed the details a little bit. For example, this is the only source I found where he identified this as his secretary's name. In others that I found later in my research, he instead provided the actual pseudonym, Ida Brenner. This is tremendously helpful because A Diary of a Young Woman was not actually the name of the series of articles that marked his debut as Ida Brenner in the Yiddish press. It was actually a series titled The Truth About Married Life. And he only debuted a second series several months later, which was actually called Letter of a Young Woman. Reading these two series together shows how writing as a woman allowed Goldberg to experiment with various different personas and styles of journalism, something that would later become a hallmark of his work under his own name. So in A Letter from a Young Woman, the narrator is a young, naive woman who is experiencing love for the first time, and the writing is very melodramatic and emotional. In contrast, The Truth About Married Life offered readers expert, psychologically driven advice on issues that married couples might face, from gambling to infertility to disappointment with one's choice of spouse. And in these articles, Goldberg usually used love as an avenue to apprise readers of the latest theories on social psychology and sexuality that he studied as a student at Columbia. In a later offshoot of this series, Goldberg even identified Ida Brenner as having a PhD in psychology, a degree that Goldberg had pursued but had failed to achieve on his own. So in these articles, Goldberg attempted to translate these psychological theories so that they were relevant to a Yiddish newspaper audience. So he promoted what he viewed as a specifically Ashkenazi Jewish version of modern companionate marriage. So for example, Ida Brenner contrasted the domestic boredom faced by middle-class or aspiring middle-class American Jews with what he described as an idealized understanding of the Jewish past in Eastern Europe, wherein, quote, the wife was an equal partner in running the business, and couples had something in common. Besides, she was a partner, a bookkeeper, a secretary. So here Goldberg was referring to a relatively common ideal for Eastern European Jews. As male religious education was prized above everything else, women were expected to be full partners in business to allow their husbands time to study. So by replacing marital business partnerships with separate spheres, Goldberg argued, American Jews had damaged the foundation of their marriages. So in reality, in Europe, these dynamics did not actually always lead to happy companionate marriages, nor were they even realized by the vast majority of the population. Instead, they were more cultural ideals than lived reality. But for Goldberg, what was important about this model was that it provided a language for him to explain modern psychological understandings of marriage in ways he hoped would resonate. So in some sources, Goldberg played down the diversity of his writing as Brenner, describing all of his articles as juicy, light, or popular. But in others, Goldberg played up the connection between his desire to blur gender boundaries and his desire to cross cultural boundaries by infusing his columns with what he learned as an undergraduate and graduate student at Columbia. So Goldberg was part of a younger cohort of Yiddish writers who had either been born in America or immigrated at a young age, often earning advanced degrees at American universities. Most of these men spent some time completely cut off from Yiddish culture or engaging equally with American culture in English and Yiddish. And when they returned to the Yiddish cultural sphere, they tried to find ways to infuse these broader academic or cultural conversations into the Yiddish press. And many of them argued that writing under a female pseudonym allowed them to do so. This dynamic unearths the full complexity of women's columns and women's pages in the Yiddish press in the 1910s and 1920s. While editors wanted to ensure that their paper included women's content, they often didn't pay particularly close attention to what women or men writing under female pseudonyms conveyed in their columns. This same dynamic was actually relatively common in the American English language press in this period, As a result, to borrow the language of historian Alice Foss, editorial inattention allowed those who wrote for women's pages a limited freedom. They often flew beneath the radar precisely because, in editorial terms, it was the least important section of the newspaper. So this meant that women's pages became a space where men writing under female pseudonyms, or sometimes women, could experiment more freely with how to translate broader cultural discourses into the Yiddish press. So the phenomenon of men writing under female pseudonyms shows that the gender politics of the press in this period created certain limitations and also certain opportunities for male and female writers. But as I explore in my book, the stakes of this moment played out very differently for women and for male writers who pretended to be women. So while sources by male writers and editors describe a supposed openness of the Yiddish press in the 1910s and 1920s to female voices, sources that privilege the experiences of female writers offer a very different assessment of this period in the history of the Yiddish press. So in letters, memoirs, fictionalized accounts, sometimes even in their columns in the Yiddish press, women suggested that editors offered far less support in practice than their public statements would suggest. So while the advent of women's pages opened up some more opportunities for female writers to contribute to newspapers, many women still felt deeply constrained by the limits that editors imposed on women writers and readers alike. When they did submit their work to the Yiddish press, women often faced harsh gendered critiques of their writing. And behind the scenes, women often performed a variety of roles in the production of Yiddish newspapers that editors rarely acknowledged publicly, serving as secretaries, translators, writers of anonymous content, which suggests that editors' support of women's careers was conditional at best. So together, the experiences of female writers and men writing under female pseudonyms bring to bear a striking contradiction. While women's voices were seen as particularly marketable, women writers often encountered so many obstacles in forging successful careers within this publishing sphere. So one interesting and particularly poignant example that reflects many of the broader experiences faced by women in attempting to forge careers working for the American Yiddish press is the life and career of Rosa Lebensboim. Lebensboim achieved her most long-lasting legacy as the author of poems which she signed under the pseudonym Anna Margolin. However, for the majority of her life, she made her living by contributing women's columns and translations to Yiddish newspapers, as well as editing the women's page Yiddish daily Der Tag for several years. From the very beginning of her career, Rosa Lebensboim faced constant accusations that her writing in various genres was so good that must have been actually written by a man. So in 1909, for instance, Lebensboim submitted her first short stories to the anarchist weekly The Arbeiterstimme under the name Chava Gross. So I think that Lebensboim's long-term partner, Reuben Iceland, the editor was so taken with these stories that he invited their author to meet with him. This invitation was in part an attempt to encourage further submissions, but by someone who he saw as relatively talented. But he was also apparently very suspicious that Chava Gross was actually a man masquerading as a woman because the editor, quote, had some experience with male beginners who sent him things under women's names. And similar rumors surrounded her about a decade later when she made her debut as a poet, writing under the pseudonym Anna Margolin. In letters from this time, Lebensboim and Reuben Iceland recounted overhearing conversations in local cafes where patrons were arguing about who the pseudonym Anna Margolin might be a cover for. While the theories varied, most seemed to agree that the poems had been written by a man. So in one exchange, Iceland linked these assumptions to the perceived quality of the poems and the ways this did not necessarily fit with assumptions at this time about the quality of writing that women were able to produce. Quote, why people want AM to be a man is beyond me. The general opinion, however, is that these poems were written by an experienced hand and a woman can't write like that. So throughout her career, Rosa Lebensboim often voiced pretty extreme disdain for Yiddish journalism, and particularly the roles that women were allowed to perform in its production and reception. So as was the case for most female writers associated with this newspaper, as well as other Yiddish dailies, most of the articles Lebensboim published under her own name appeared on the paper's women's page. While many Yiddish literary figures read her women's columns with keen interest, she never held her journalistic work in particularly high regard. In fact, according to Iceland, Lebensboim used to become so mad when someone praised her articles that she would leave the room because she viewed her work as a means to make a living rather than a worthy literary pursuit in and of itself. This actually was not a perspective that was unique to Lebensboim or really to writers of women's interest material in general. Many Yiddish poets and novelists actually made their living writing articles for newspapers and were equally dismissive of their journalistic output. But Lebensboim seems to have been particularly constrained in her role as a women's columnist. And at times, her critiques of the press seeped into her journalistic work. So in 1915, Lebensboim devoted a column to criticizing gender imbalances she saw as endemic in English language newspapers. So one sort of great quote that I found from her: "A strange thing about the local press is that it seems to be open to women and they occupy an important niche. But in reality," she asserted, "women are able to write frankly and freely only about two things, clothing and love. Moreover, there are no women in American newspapers who are city editors, managers, or editorial writers." So in her view, editors also limited the style that writers could employ in their women's columns, as they must write with a banal style because originality is the quickest way to the wastebasket. So she was a beautiful writer. I love her writing. It's very evocative. So in this particular column, she did not explicitly address the gender dynamics in the Yiddish press, but it's likely that Lebensboim indirectly intended to critique the Anglophone press for highlighting similar problems to those she was finding in the Day and other Yiddish newspapers. But at other times, Lebensboim's critiques of contemporary newspaper culture actually went much closer to home. So later that same year, she devoted an installment of her column to disparaging Woodrow Wilson's decade-old book, A History of the American People, and its male-centric approach to history. So one quote from that column is, quote, "If a resident of the planet Mars should read the book, he would surely think that on Earth, God forbid, women do not exist." She argued that Wilson's chronicle was actually part of a broader problem, saying that most history books written by men relegated women to serving as the silent partner of progress. As an antidote, she suggested reading work by female historians who could offer a counterweight to stories written and dominated by men. So this critique of Wilson's work would likely have piqued the interest of her readers because A History of the American People was actually being serialized in translation in this newspaper at this time. So by arguing that excluding women from history writ large provide a skewed sense of the historical past, she was also slyly suggesting gender imbalances that existed within the newspaper in which her articles appeared. So when Rosa Lebensboim accused the American popular press in her articles of making it seem as if newspapers welcome female journalists, when in reality they constrained how and what women could write, she therefore may have been describing not only her own career, but the careers of other female journalists for the Yiddish press. Most women contributed women's columns and other forms of writing that were considered the particular purview of female writers, short stories, advice columns, poetry, and many felt very constrained by having to write this material. But the careers of women in Yiddish journalism also reflects a more complicated dynamic. So on the pages of Yiddish newspapers, it seemed as if women only authored one form of content because this was the material that they published under their own names. But in reality, over the course of their careers, many women contribute in more varied ways. So this, for example, what you have on the screen is a payroll from the Day or the Tog that shows Lebensboim as translating material in a given week, none of which ran with attribution to her on the pages of the newspaper. Her name is also spelled in multiple ways in different payrolls for the same newspaper, and sometimes she's listed under her married name, not her maiden name. So this gives a sense of exactly how difficult it is to trace the full experiences of women who worked for the Yiddish press. To conclude the talk, I wanted to give you sort of an overview that I've primarily focused on the lives and careers of several authors, especially 3 authors, to explore the different ways in which a focus on gender illuminates the history of the Yiddish press. Zelikovich's columns typify how editors of the first Yiddish dailies used women's columns to experiment with how to translate ideological messages to a mass audience. 30 years later, Goldberg's columns reveal how diverse the content of the Yiddish press had become and how writing as a woman allowed certain young men a gateway into the Yiddish press. At the same time, the careers and writings of women like Rosa Lebensboim reveal the distance between the ways in which women readers and writers figured into the rhetorical tropes surrounding the Yiddish press and the much more complicated lived reality of these women's lives. So again, in my book, these are only 3 of many individuals whose lives and work illustrate the importance of gender to the development of the Yiddish press, and I'm happy to elaborate on anything I've explored today or any other aspects of my research. Thanks for your attention. Very curious to hear your thoughts and reactions.
Thank you so much. Wow, this is a great presentation and very provocative. So I have I want to encourage folks to share their questions in the chat. I do have one here from Joel Schechter. He asks, did the writers for these papers visit editorial offices in person? Wouldn't their gender be found out if they did visit the office in person, or did they simply mail in articles?
They often mailed in the articles. Goldberg said that he would have female friends send in the articles for him, like walk the papers over to the office, or his other authors would just send them in by mail. A lot of these newspapers had columns where the editor would correspond with potential writers and sort of give critiques on the pages of the newspaper of their writing. So a lot of these interactions were happening sort of proto-virtually as opposed to in person.
Right. So I'm curious about your research process. In accessing so many sources as you did, and the sort of combination of what was digitized, what did the search for these sources end up looking like for you?
Sure. So it started out by reading full runs of all of these newspapers, which was a very painstaking and long process. As Howard and I were talking about before this started, most of these newspapers were not digitized when I started this research process about 10 years ago. They were mostly available on microfilm. And this website called the Historical Jewish Press has since appeared, which is a combination of the New York Public Library, various university libraries, the National Library of Israel, have gotten together and have digitized many historic Jewish newspapers, including full runs of many of the most successful Yiddish dailies. And so that made it possible to continue this research during COVID, which is immensely valuable. And then, so I went through all of these newspapers and scrolled through them for all names that I was seeing, various trends that I was seeing. And then I sort of triangulated that with memoirs, behind the scenes sources like archives to try to figure out how I could get a fuller picture of what was going on.
Thank you. So we have a question about the rate of literacy, I guess in general and particularly among women readers.
Sure. So this is a little hard to pin down exactly. We don't have great literacy data from this period, and the literacy data we have is mostly about whether people can write their names, which is not actually giving us a lot of information about whether they could read newspapers. But the sort of general thought is that anyone who migrated before about 1900 was less likely to be particularly literate. And if you migrated after about 1903, 1904, you were more likely to be literate. So you see in these newspapers real changes in the actual language of the newspaper as well. The early people writing for these newspapers were a sort of intelligentsia, and they tried to create newspapers that were accessible to people with very limited literacy. So very easy to read, lots of religious references for people to understand, very big type, lots of pictures. And then over time, the language became more complex as more people got used to reading newspapers and as more people were coming with a higher level of literacy. Another thing that we have a lot of access to is in memoirs, we see a lot of people reading newspapers out loud to family members who cannot read, meaning that one, the circulation figures are very far off from the actual readership of these newspapers. And two, there is evidence that in many cases, the mothers of families did not necessarily know how to read at first, but then these newspapers were read aloud to them, and eventually they started to learn how to read from these newspapers.
Interesting. Thank you. I'm curious, I know, the number of Yiddish newspapers and their circulation dropped, over the years, and especially in the post-war period. Most were no longer extant. But even as there were fewer, did the number of women writing for them increase during that period?
To a certain extent, yes, but nowhere near sort of to a number that felt like parity. And there still continue to be many men who were using female pseudonyms, so it's hard to trace exactly how many women were writing for these newspapers.
And can you talk about how you came into this work? What brought you into this very committed project of study?
Yeah. So I knew I wanted to do something related to American Jewish history. And when I was starting the search for graduate school, I started learning Yiddish around that time because I figured it would be a good research language. And basically, I fell in love with Yiddish while learning Yiddish. And I started to dig into these questions about gender, and it sort of took over as my sort of passion for what I wanted to devote my first book to.
Great. Martin Bobrowski asks, did the mechanisms of paying the occasional contributors influence their style of writing? And was there a gender pay differential?
So unfortunately, a lot of these newspapers decided not to keep most of their payrolls. I have one newspaper that kept payrolls, and they kept them very inconsistently. So this is a relatively famous story in my field of research, but when the Forward moved offices, they threw out all of their paperwork. So we have very few archival documents from the Forward, the most successful Yiddish daily. Most of what they kept were photographs. So we can't tell exactly what the pay differentials were between men and women. We know anecdotally that women said they were paid less than men. And we definitely know that people who wrote columns freelance received much, much lower salaries than people who were on staff. And women were much, much more likely to have freelance associations with newspapers than to be regular members of the staff.
Thank you. So Judy Kunofsky asks, do we know whether any of the women writers hung out with each other? Were they mutually supportive or competitive?
So again, we have limited access to this, but the pieces of information we do have give a sense of support from one another. There are certain rivalries that existed in this world. It was a relatively small world. There was a lot of competition. But for example, when Rosa Lebensboim was the editor of the women's page, she wrote these beautiful letters to some of the other writers when they were off on vacation. They would ask how each other was doing. They would support each other's work. So there was some sense of community and continuity there that was really nice to see.
Great. So Judy Baston asks, were Yiddish papers organized by the Newspaper Guild?
Sorry, could you rephrase that question?
Were Yiddish papers organized by the Newspaper Guild? I assume that's a labor union question, but maybe not.
So the Yiddish newspapers had their own union. It was called the Ayel Peretz Writers Union. So for all of these newspapers, they were unionized, and the union was somewhat effective, not particularly effective. But there were some women who were involved in the union, but it was mostly a male-dominated organization.
Okay. So this was really this was great. So thanks. Is there anything you want to leave us with, Ayelet?
No, this has been a wonderful experience. If you have any other questions, I'm very happy to.
Okay. Oh, actually, we do have one last question that just came through from Jay Resnick. He notes that in one of your slides, Miriam Karpilov's name appeared. Did she write women's columns?
She did, yeah. For the same newspaper as Rosa Lebensboim. She wrote for a while there. So this is a great opportunity for me to the work of an amazing colleague, Jessica Kierzane, who has published many amazing translations of women's columns and novels by Miriam Karpilov. And her most recent work of translation, it was published a couple of months ago, is a short novella called A Provincial Newspaper. And it was as basically a very lightly fictionalized account of Karpilov's brief time working for a newspaper in Boston, which she calls a provincial newspaper because it's not in New York. I'm from Boston. And so there's like a little bit of sort of anti-Boston bias in there that I did not appreciate. But it talks about her experiences writing women's columns and really not enjoying writing women's columns because she would turn in these what she thought were amazing, thoughtful critiques of social issues, and her editors would be like, why don't you just write fun things about fashion? And so my book and Jessica's book actually work really well in tandem because it gives you a firsthand account and then these broader patterns.
Great, thank you. And we do have that book at the library if anybody's interested in borrowing it. I am going to, so we're going to leave, and I want to thank you for being with us. This was a great presentation, and thanks everybody for joining. Thanks Claes California and the Workers Circle Library to Ring. We really appreciate it, and this was a wonderful afternoon. Okay.
Yeah, thank you all so much.
All right. Be well, everybody.
Yeah, thank you all for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Goodbye.